Everyone knows the story of Mozart, the child prodigy who was writing symphonies at 5 years old, putting adult contemporaries of his time to shame. His music is legendary, with many of his works being considered the gold standard of classical music. It's safe to say that essentially he's become immortal at this point. As long as there's an interest in classical music, there will be people playing and studying Mozart. But the death of Mozart is something that is disagreed on far more than anything that happened in his life. Mozart died at an early age, under some mysterious circumstances, and left behind a work that has become just as famous or infamous as Mozart himself. There's a large amount of misinformation from various sources that has muddied the waters on this topic, and today we're going to explore the sources of this misinformation and try to set the record straight. The movie Amadeus. Released in 1984, this Emmy-winning period film is one of the major culprits of misinformation. But as you'll see, it certainly isn't the only one. Before actually diving into this, I just want to say that this movie is fantastic. I would highly recommend it to anyone that hasn't seen it, musician or not. Just know that a large part of it is historically inaccurate. The history behind this movie is a long one. The 1984 release is based on a stage play that was written in 1979, which is based on an operetta written by Rimsky-Korsakov in 1897, which was based on a play written by Alexander Pushkin in 1830, Adaptation to the Fourth Power. The play released in 1830 and the opera in 1879 are almost identical in terms of the story. A composer named Antonio Salieri laments in the first scene about his jealousy of Mozart, and in the second scene he poisons him and kills him. The movie and the stage play take these basic ideas and run with them. Similar to the earlier adaptations, the movie shows the rivalry, jealousy, and sabotage of Mozart by Salieri. But in the movie, Salieri devises a plan to commission a Requiem from Mozart, then kill him, steal his work, and present the Requiem at Mozart's funeral as his own composition. Unfortunately, this plan didn't quite work out for Salieri, as Mozart became gravely ill in the middle of writing it. The best scene in this movie is Salieri pushing Mozart to finish the Requiem the night before he dies, but ultimately he is unable. This scene is amazing, but unfortunately, that's just not what happened. In fact, most of the plot of this movie is incredibly misleading, especially when it comes to Salieri. The two big takeaways from this movie is that Salieri is a jealous, evil bastard that had a hand in killing Mozart, and also that he was a terrible composer himself who had to steal other people's work in order to be remembered. And neither of those are true, at least according to all the evidence we have. Though it is true that he did not have an impact on the same level as Mozart, he was no slouch. Throughout his life, he composed around 40 operas, and overall put out around 650 pieces of just about every genre that was popular at his time. His works were considered highly influential to his contemporaries, and he had several important positions during his lifetime, including court composer, director of Italian opera, and imperial royal Kapellmeister. There are some Mozart letters suggesting that he was being held down by Salieri because Salieri held positions of authority over Mozart, and there was a difference in opinion of style between the German and Italian opera philosophies. Mozart said at one point it was as though the only eyes that mattered to the emperor was Salieri's. It was likely that there was some amount of tension between them, as they were both clawing their way to favor in the emperor's eyes, especially when they competed for several of the same positions in the 1780s. However, there's also a lot of evidence that they supported each other's work. When Salieri was appointed Kapellmeister in 1788, he revived a Mozart opera instead of writing a new one. Several of Mozart's pieces, including his Symphony No. 40, had been premiered on the suggestion of Salieri, and Mozart and Salieri even composed a cantata together. In Mozart's last surviving letter from 1791, Mozart writes that he and Salieri attended the Magic Flute together, and Mozart seemed to be quite excited about Salieri's cheers for his work. Salieri was even a part of Mozart's son's education shortly after Mozart's death. It seems to me that there was some beef in their younger years that had been squashed by the end of the 1780s, and it is highly unlikely that Salieri would have tried to kill Mozart, especially because even though Mozart's legacy is far greater, at that time, Salieri was the far more successful one of the pair. However, after Mozart's death, a rumor began that Salieri had poisoned and killed Mozart. This rumor is attributed to being started by Karl von Weber, who was a cousin of Mozart's wife. Essentially, this was an attempt by the Germans to make the Italians look bad. This rumor circulated on and off throughout the decades after Mozart's death, but it came to a head in the early 1820s where it exploded into popular culture, leading Salieri to have a nervous breakdown in 1823. Apparently during or shortly after a self-deletion attempt in 1823, Salieri confessed to killing Mozart in a manic state of mind. Later, when he was more lucid, he stated, "I can say in good faith that there is no truth to the absurd rumor that I poisoned Mozart." But two of his servants that had been with him that night testified that they had never heard him confess to the murder in the first place, so who knows if that's even true. Salieri died in 1825, but the rumor persisted. Pushkin's play, play, the one we mentioned in the beginning, came out in 1830, perpetuating the rumor. Okay, so the movie and other pieces of media essentially framed Salieri. I think it's quite clear he didn't kill him. That rumor, which allegedly was started by Karl von Weber, is definitely partially to blame, but where did the rest of the confusion come from? The strange commission of the Requiem and the various mysteries surrounding it. The Requiem confusion. Mozart's death is forever linked to his Requiem, both in the film and in reality. In both cases, he died while writing it. But in the movie, Salieri is the one who commissions the piece and plans to take credit for it, and he's also shown helping to compose it. I think we can safely say that none of this is true. But the actual story isn't really all that stranger than fiction. The Requiem was commissioned by Franz von Walsegg for the one-year anniversary of his young wife's death, but it was commissioned through an anonymous intermediary, so Mozart didn't know who it was. Walsegg himself was an amateur musician who had a habit of commissioning work and then claiming them as his own. More than likely, this is where the movie got the idea of Salieri attempting to steal Mozart's work. Mozart began the work but then became sick and apparently began to believe that he was writing the piece for himself and that he had been poisoned. Then he died in the middle of writing it, only having completed part of the work, but the completed piece was delivered to the court in 1792. So who finished the piece, and how much of the work was Mozart's, and how much was someone else's? And where did the suggestion that Mozart believed he was poisoned come from? His wife. Most of the confusion around this piece and around the final parts of his life in general can be traced back to his wife Constance, but we can't blame her too much. It was actually all for a reason that most of us can probably understand. Mozart's finances were not good. He had a lot of debt and unfortunately died before he realized any real monetary success from his work, and when he died he left this financial burden to his wife. When the Requiem was commissioned, only half of the fee was paid up front, but the other half would not be paid out until the work was finished. But since Mozart died in the middle of writing it, he left his wife in a strange position. She needed the work to be finished, but she needed the commissioner to believe that Mozart had written the whole thing. This would also be important for the future of the piece, as it would be played more often if the public believed that it was composed entirely by Mozart. So she came up with a story that he had worked on the Requiem until the day of his death, completed most of it, and left specific instructions on how to finish it to his assistant. In reality, she hired two other composers to finish the work, Joseph von Ebler and Franz Sussmayer. But it's not even really clear where the work of Mozart ends and the work of the other composers begin. The Requiem is broken down into 8 main sections. Some of these sections are their own movements, and some sections are broken down into several movements of their own. In total, we have 15 movements, resulting in a massive piece of music. Based on the original manuscript that we have, Mozart completed the entire first and second movements, the introduction, and the Kyrie. He also completed skeleton outlines of the sequence up to the first 8 bars of the Lacrimosa. These skeletons consisted of mostly the basso continuo, organ parts, and melody for each movement. After the death of Mozart, the score was first passed to Joseph Ebler, who completed orchestration of a small section before passing it off to Sussmayer. It is unclear how much Ebler did. Some sources say it was a very small chunk, but others have said that a large chunk of Sussmayer's work was based on Ebler's sketches. But Sussmayer is credited mostly for completing the rest of the Requiem where Mozart left off. But this can be debated because of the mysterious scraps of paper that went missing when the score was handed off. Apparently, these scraps contain detailed instructions on how to finish the piece. It is unknown how much Sussmayer relied on these scraps for the completion of the work. He claims that the Sanctus, Benedictus, and Agnus Dei were all of his own work, but it could be that Mozart actually had a detailed plan for the rest of the piece and Sussmayer just had to fill in the blanks, and we will probably never know that for sure. Also, after the Requiem was complete, Sussmayer recopied all of the manuscript in his own hand, making it even more difficult to tell one person's work from another. The Sussmayer version is the one that is most commonly played today, but several musicologists have rejected this version and completed their own versions that they believed to be more accurate to Mozart's original sketches. Just another wrinkle in the story. Conflicting interviews. The story kept getting more and more cloudy as time went on. A number of interviews were conducted with Mozart's wife after his death by biographers that were interested in the life and death of Mozart. But as you might expect, the interviews do not all match up with each other. Each time the story changed. Friedrich Rochlitz published a set of Mozart anecdotes that he claimed to have collected during a meeting with Constance in 1796. The basic statements he made about Mozart leading up to his death were, Mozart didn't know the identity of the commissioner. He started the project right away, but his health was already poor and he fainted multiple times while working. He shared the thought with his wife that he was writing the piece for himself. He spoke of strange thoughts about the commissioner, such as that he could be the devil. Fran Niemstick interviewed her in 1798. In this interview, his wife made these statements. Mozart didn't know the name of the commissioner, but he couldn't accept the messenger's request immediately because he was scheduled to go back to Prague. He fell ill while working, not before, and told his wife, I am only too conscious that my end will be not long in coming. For sure someone has poisoned me. I cannot rid myself of this thought. His wife then took took the score away, but Mozart had it with him on the day of his death in his bed. She then claimed that the messenger took the score away unfinished and she never learned the name of the messenger, but this couldn't be true by her own earlier admissions. George Neeson, her second husband, interviewed her, and this was slightly before his death in 1826. In this interview, she said, Mozart didn't accept the messenger's request at first because of his commissions to go to Prague and then the coronation of the emperor. He later wrote to the commissioner saying that he would accept the project, but he did not yet have a date promised for when he could complete the work, and then he started composing the piece when he returned from Prague. But this suggests that Mozart did know the name of the commissioner, which contradicts the earlier statements. I believe that his wife did this intentionally to again protect her financial interests. The more mystery that surrounded this piece, the more interest there would be in this work and the work of her husband in general. It is possible that the truth is in there somewhere. Mozart may have believed that he was poisoned, and he may have said some strange things in his sickly state before his death, but the way that the story changes makes it more difficult to believe. So we have the rumor of Karl von Weber about Salieri's involvement in the death, Constance Mozart deliberately misleading everyone around the circumstances of both his death and the Requiem, and then other pieces of media highly stretching the truth starting in 1830, all the way up to the Amadeus magnum opus. So how did he actually die? We don't know, at least not definitively. Mozart officially died on December 5th, 1791, but Mozart's body has never been found, and there was no autopsy performed at the time of his death. Based on the symptoms he had according to various sources around the time of his death, there have been roughly 140 possible diagnoses that have been speculated on since his death. Some of these include rheumatic fever, the flu, syphilis, tuberculosis, and vitamin D deficiency. It's likely that this legend died a very human death of disease, but we will likely never know for sure unless his body is recovered. It is believed that he was buried in a mass grave in St. Mark's Cemetery in Austria, but the exact location of his body is unknown. So that's a lot of information, and a lot of it conflicts with each other, but I think amongst all of the legend and controversy is a relatively clear story. Again, it's hard to know the exact truth, but from all the reading I have done, this is what makes the most sense to me. But that doesn't mean I'm right, it's just how I made sense of it. Antonio Salieri had nothing to do with the death of Mozart. They were professional rivals at times in their careers, and some tension existed between them. They were supportive of each other's work at the end of the 1870s, and it was clear that they admired each other. Near the end of his life, Mozart was commissioned to complete a requiem for an anonymous, at least to him, source, which he died in the middle of writing. The cause of his death is ultimately unknown, but it was likely due to disease, not to murder. A portion of the work was completed by himself before Sussmayer completed the rest after his death. Exactly the line between what is Mozart's work and what is Sussmayer's is unknown. His wife deliberately tried to muddy the waters around the crediting and other mysteries around the Requiem to protect her own financial interests. What exactly is true will probably never be known unless more evidence is found. Salieri became the victim of rumors after the death of Mozart, which led to a self-deletion attempt in 1823, before he eventually passed away in 1825. The rumors continued to spiral more and more and became more outlandish as time went on, leading to Pushkin's play in 1830, Rimsky-Korsakov's opera in 1897, Peter Schaeffer's play in 1979, and the film Amadeus in 1984. So we've come full circle, from the beginning back to the movie. That was a lot to unravel. If I missed something, be sure to let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this, please consider leaving a like and subscribe, and check out my Patreon. Link is in the description.